What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my top 40 running back rankings for 2024 fantasy football. And let's not waste any time. Let's just dive right into it. Starting off in Tier 1, I have Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, and Bijan Robinson. Now, if I wanted to get super specific, you could probably say CMC's in his own tier. Then you have Breece, Bijan Robinson. I already have 10 tiers. I'm not trying to, nitpick that specifically. But starting off here with Christian McCaffrey, he's still my clear 101 overall. I'm not concerned about the calf injury. I think he'll be fine heading into the season. Then we have Breece Hall. Now, earlier in the offseason, I thought Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson were pretty neck and neck. Thought they were pretty interchangeable. At this point, I do favor Breece Hall here as my second running back. Averaged 20 PPR points per game once he was cleared for a full workload last year. Is heading into this season with a massive quarterback upgrade. Also a much better offensive line. So I think Breece Hall is a great pick as the running back 2. And then for Bijan Robinson, I think he has 3-down workhorse upside, should see a much larger role this year, and also it's going to be a much better offense with Kirk Cousins coming in, new offensive coordinator. I'm pretty high on this Falcons offense, these weapons. So I think Bijan Robinson, very fair to be the running back 3. Now shifting into tier 2, it's actually going to be a one-man tier here, and it's going to be Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, I originally had tier 2 as Jahmyr Gibbs and Jonathan Taylor. I think that was my last video. I've pivoted away from that a little bit here, and I have Jahmyr Gibbs here by himself. And I think Gibbs is someone who has a little bit of a slept-on ceiling. I think people look at him, they see he's in somewhat of a split with David Montgomery. He's not going to have this workhorse workload, and they think maybe he doesn't have that upside. But in his last 10 games last year, he averaged 19.4 PPR points per game, and that was on, a season where he only had a 51% opportunity share. I think he can grow on that, and I also think he has some pretty significant room to grow in the receiving department. That was kind of his calling card heading into the season. He ended up hitting as a great pure runner, hitting the touchdown department. The receiving was fine, but I think there are going to be much bigger receiving seasons to come out of Jahmyr Gibbs, and that definitely could happen here in 2024. Now, shifting into tier 3, I do have some shakeup within this tier, and probably one of the more controversial rankings I'm going to have is Devon Achane up as the running back 5. On certain platforms, you're seeing Achane fall to round 3. I think either on ESPN or Yahoo, he's like a mid to late round 3 pick. I'm obviously very high on him, and he's probably the player I'm going to have the most shares of heading into this season. From what I've seen, the concern around Devon Achane stems from his size, and then also this being a Dolphins committee with Raheem Mostert, who had a great year last year, and then also potentially the rookie Jalen Wright. And I don't think those are unreasonable concerns. I think it's fair to be worried about both of those things. He was 5'9", 188 at the combine. I'd assume he's a little bit heavier than that at this point, heading into year 2. But it's true, he's not going to be a workhorse. He's not going to handle the same type of workload that a guy like Jonathan Taylor or Saquon Barkley might be able to handle. And I do think this is going to be somewhat of a split. Mostert's going to be involved. I think Jalen Wright's going to find a way, to weasel his way into this offense in some way. Maybe he's taken some of Mostert's work. Maybe one of these guys gets hurt and he's able to step up, kind of earn a role. But in today's day and age, in fantasy football, you do not need this monster workload to deliver a big fantasy season, because if you can hit in the touchdown department, be a great pass catcher, that can make up for not carrying the ball 20 plus times a game. In Achane's 9 games last year, where he had above a 10% snap share, so pretty much just the games where he's playing his typical role, what you'd expect in 2024, he averaged 20.8 PPR points per game. That would have been the running back 3 on the season. And in those games, his workload was not all that bad. 11.2 carries, 3.9 targets per game. Him getting 15 opportunities is definitely not a killer, especially with how efficient he is on this Dolphins offense that's going to be able to rip off big plays. He's going to have a lot of touchdown upside. And Achane is just probably the most explosive running back in the NFL. The dude averaged 7.8 yards per carry on over 100 attempts. He led the NFL in yards per touch, fantasy points per opportunity, and breakaway run rate. He also led the NFL in rushing yards over expected per attempt. His rushing yards over expected per attempt was at 2.87. That's a full yard better than the next highest player since the NFL started tracking that in 2018. So Achane's rookie year was truly remarkable. You don't have to draft him here as the running back 5. If I'm playing in a ton of leagues, I'm not taking him as my 201, my 202, because on certain platforms he's going to fall mid-late second into the third round. But if I was drafting one single team, I would be drafting him as my running back 5. That's really just how high I am on him heading into the season. So Achane, running back 5. My running back 6 and running back 7, I think they're actually very similar. It's going to be Jonathan Taylor and Saquon Barkley. I mentioned how I dropped Jonathan Taylor a little bit, and it's just the more I thought about it, I wasn't overly high on Saquon, and I feel like they're just in very similar spots. I think we're expecting both these guys to be high volume runners on very efficient rushing attacks. Eagles have obviously been a great rushing offense. Colts have been in the past when JT's been healthy. With Richardson there, I think they're also going to be very, very efficient. But they both have the same question marks, and those question marks are receiving usage and touchdown upside. Jonathan Taylor, I don't think he's ever going to be a guy who's going to be a high volume pass catcher. He's maxed out at 40 receptions. That was with Carson Wentz. Seems unlikely he gets there with a mobile quarterback like Anthony Richardson. And then you're also going to have Anthony Richardson, who's going to be active on the goal line, a massive quarterback who can use his legs and, steal some of those touchdowns that maybe would have just been handed off to Jonathan Taylor. And then for Saquon, after his rookie year, it looked like he was going to be a dude who's flirting with 100 receptions every single season. He has not hit 60 receptions in a season since then, and it's just tough for me to envision the Eagles being anything better than league average when it comes to pass attempts to the running back. You have Jalen Hurts. He's going to use his legs more than he's going to want to check down. They had DeAndre Swift last year. They still weren't better than league average, and DeAndre Swift is a great pass catcher out of the backfield. You also had Kenneth Gainwell, who can catch passes. So that's a concern. And then obviously you have Jalen Hurts, the tush push, taking those touchdowns away from Saquon Barkley. So they can have larger workloads than Jahmyr Gibbs, than Devon Achane. But if they're not smashing in the touchdown department and they're underwhelming as pass catchers, they're just not going to have the same ceilings as those guys, even if the workload's not going to be there. So I don't hate these guys for fantasy, but with where I have them ranked, probably not going to have many shares of them in a redraft. Then my final tier 3 running back, it is going to be Kyren Williams. And I have a pretty tough time ranking Kyren because I think you could make an argument that he could be ahead of Saquon Barkley, ahead of Jonathan Taylor. He was the running back 2 in points per game last year. He played very well, and we know Sean McVay likes a workhorse. I just think there are a few avenues where Kyren Williams has the potential to lose work, whereas I feel like Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, they're very established within their offense. They may not have the highest ceiling, but like Jonathan Taylor's not getting replaced. He's going to be the workhorse. Same thing goes for Saquon Barkley, barring an injury with those guys. I think you could see Blake Corum starting to work in on the goal line. Kyren Williams, not the biggest back. Blake Corum, great touchdown success in college, even though he's also not the biggest dude. But I think the bigger concern for me comes with Kyren's durability or the lack of it. He's had issues staying on the field, which just could straight up, create an opening for Blake Corum. He's had some foot problems through his first few years in the NFL. I think he was already banged up prior to training camp, which isn't ideal. And then also you just have to consider the fact that day 3 picks typically have very little security. Like if you think about it, the way Kyren played last year, if he was a round 1, round 2 pick, I don't think the Rams are going out and drafting another running back on day 2. But since he's a day 3 guy, they're not super invested in him. They go out, they get a capable guy in Blake Corum. So I think he's very talented. If they do use him as the workhorse, I think he has a pretty high ceiling. But there's also some added risk where Blake Corum could kind of become a nuisance here for Kyren Williams. Now shifting into tier 4, one of the guys that's probably my biggest risers since my last video is going to be Isaiah Pacheco, and I really just keep getting higher and higher on him. He was the running back 14 last year at 15.3 points per game, but it really does seem like he is lined up for a monster 2024. Jerick McKinnon is gone. He's the guy that was kind of operating as the Chiefs' pass-catching back. The Chiefs really did not add any legit competition to their running back room, and that's always been the concern I've had with Isaiah Pacheco, is he's another one of these guys, doesn't have the draft capital, day 3 pick, he's very easily replaceable, whether it's free agency, through the draft, but all the moves or the lack thereof that the Chiefs have made make it seem like they do view Isaiah Pacheco as their clear-cut running back 1. Last year, from week 4 on, they kind of unleashed him. He averaged 16.4 PPR points per game. I think there's reason to believe with McKinnon gone, Pacheco sees an uptick in his receiving usage. And then I also think the Chiefs are a prime candidate to bounce back offensively as a whole. Last year, they were pretty league average in terms of their points per game. Every other year with Patrick Mahomes as the starter, they've been top 6. Their weapons are much better, so I think Pacheco also has the upside of hitting in the touchdown department. So I have Pacheco up here at RB9. I honestly don't think it's crazy to bump him up higher than this, because I think if you're comparing a guy like Pacheco to Saquon or Jonathan Taylor, I think they have the opportunity to be in a very similar range when it comes to their usage. I think the thing is just Isaiah Pacheco is a little bit more unproven, kind of like what I talked about with Kyron, like Saquon, JT. There's no shot they're losing their starting jobs, and I don't think Pacheco is going to lose it, but he does seem just a little bit less secure than some of those dudes going ahead of him. Also in Tier 4, I have Travis Etienne. He was the running back 7 in points per game last year, saw really strong usage, 6th in opportunity share, but his efficiency pretty much tanked. He was a super efficient option in 2022 that really fell off in 2023. I think he can definitely see some nice upside if he can blend the 2022 efficiency with his 2023 workload. I also think this Jaguars offense is going to have a bounce back here in 2024. So I think Travis Etienne, fine guy to pick at like the 2-3 turn area. And then my final Tier 4 running back, it's going to be Derrick Henry, RB11. And I know people aren't going to like this. I can already sense people hitting the comment section, shredding me for having Derrick Henry ranked this low. But I just think he carries a large amount of risk for someone who doesn't have a ton of upside. He's a 30-year-old running back with a lot of tread on his tires. He has the second most career touches of active running backs. Ezekiel Elliott is number 1, and we know he's been pretty cooked for at least a couple of years now. In the one full season where Derrick Henry hit 20-plus points per game, he averaged 23.6 carries a game. I don't think the Ravens want to run him into the ground. I do think this is a pretty solid fit. They don't throw a ton to their pass catchers. Derrick Henry's never been a big pass catcher. They're going to be very efficient on the ground. He's going to have a solid workload, but I don't think they're going to be giving Derrick Henry, at this stage in his career, 23, 24 carries a game, especially when they want him for the long run. Like, they're not going to be limping into the playoffs, or they don't want to be limping into the playoffs. He's not giving you much as a pass catcher, so I have a tough time taking him in the second round. I am taking guys like Etienne, Pacheco over him. I know he's seemingly been indestructible, but at some point he's going to slip, whether it's his play, an injury. At some point it's going to happen, and I would rather not be reaching for him in like the early to mid-second round when I can snag some of these other options. So Derrick Henry, my running back 11. Now pivoting into Tier 5, we're going to start off with Joe Mixon, and I think he's lined up to be a pretty solid workhorse on a top-tier offense. He's never been the most efficient option, but the competition's not really there. His running back 2 is Dameon Pierce, who was just really rough last year. I could easily just see Joe Mixon kind of voluming his way to a running back 1 season. Does not seem like a crazy outcome. Very capable of finishing as like a back-end RB1, maybe mid-tier RB1 if he really hits in the touchdown department. This is going to be a very good Texans offense, and Joe Mixon should be their clear lead running back. My running back 13 is going to be James Cook, and I feel like there are some very clear pros and cons for James Cook. Some of the pros, he was very efficient last year, 4.7 yards per carry, top 10 in rushing yards over expected per attempt. He was also very efficient as a pass catcher, 2nd in yards per reception, 6th in yards per out run, 5th in yards per touch. Aside from like some drop issues, overall a very solid season. He's going to be on a very good offense. This Bills team is going to score points. Some of the cons is that the Bills seem very clear that they do not want to use him on the goal line. They're fine having Josh Allen, just ram his way in there for touchdowns. They also added Ray Davis, who I think could kind of filter in near the goal line. So I do think his touchdown upside is limited. But you're looking at a running back who I think is talented, has some receiving upside, is going to be an efficient runner, and on a good offense. I think that's definitely someone who can deliver like fringe running back 1 production. Then my running back 14 is going to be Josh Jacobs, and I know a lot of people are going to think this is very, very low. And I'm admitting, like, I'm going to be lower on Josh Jacobs than most people. I just think that LaFleur hasn't done or said anything that makes me believe he wants to pivot away from a running back by committee. We've seen this throughout his entire career. Aaron Jones was always someone who could have had this insane upside if he wasn't a part of a committee. He always had that capped workload. And that's not to say Aaron Jones was disappointing. He had some great seasons, some running back 1 seasons, but Aaron Jones was also an ultra efficient option and a great pass catcher. We look at LaFleur's time when he was the offensive coordinator in Tennessee. He had Derrick Henry at a 50% opportunity share. Him and Dion Lewis were pretty much splitting the opportunities 50-50. Derrick Lewis, the guy who's known for having these insane monster workloads, 20-plus carries a game, he was splitting the backfield pretty much even with Dion Lewis. Josh Jacobs also last year didn't play well enough to make me think he's going to come in and the Packers are going to want to force feed him. He was 3.5 yards per carry, negative 0.37 rushing yards over expected per attempt. No, yards per carry is not great, but that rushing yards over expected per attempt number is also bad. Zamir White was significantly better, behind the same offensive line in that same offense. So I'm definitely not as optimistic as most people on Josh Jacobs. I think they remember that 2022 season. They think this Packers offense is going to be good, and I agree with that. But I just don't know if this is the same player, and I don't think his usage is going to be anywhere near what it was back in 2022. And then my final tier 5 running back, someone who I'm coming around on a little bit, it's going to be Rachaad White. Looking back at last year, he was the running back 10 in points per game. He was 4th in snap share, 7th in opportunity share, was used like a workhorse, had a really solid overall workload. The problem here for Rachaad White is he going to be able to, maintain the workload he had last year? The Bucs have brought in a new offensive coordinator, and that's fine, right? Like, new OC, somewhat of a concern. The bigger concern here is that Rachaad White just didn't run the ball all that well. Like, he was given a huge workload, but he was at 3.6 yards per carry. He had the most rushing yards under expected amongst all running backs. So he was objectively a bad runner, and it's tough for me to project someone who, was just not good in an area to maintain like a massive workload as a runner. You know what I'm saying here? Like, if he does keep the workhorse role, yeah, he's going to pay off, but he also didn't play well enough to establish that is his role. No one can take it. The other thing, though, is that the competition is just really poor on this Bucs offense. You have some of the same dudes from last year. Their only notable addition was day 3 Bucky Irving, who very undersized, not a great athlete. So the competition is pretty weak. So I'm in this tough spot where it's like, at running back 15, if he keeps his workload from last year, he'll probably pay off. But he's also just hasn't played well enough to make me feel super confident that he has locked down this workhorse role. So those are my thoughts on Rachaad White. Very tough player, in my opinion, to evaluate. Now, shifting into tier 6, my running back 16 is going to be Alvin Kamara. And with Kamara, you're kind of just hoping he holds on to a solid chunk of the usage he saw last year in 2023. Has some competition with Kendre Miller, Jamal Williams. But the competition's also, I don't know, like Jamal Williams didn't do much last year. Kendre Miller can't stay healthy. Like, you'd think the day 2 running back from last year, would be able to work out a role, but the Saints don't seem super pleased with him. He hasn't been able to get on the field. And so it wouldn't shock me if Kamara ends up being a fringe running back 1 just by racking up a ton of kind of like empty receiving volume and being decently involved on the ground. It always does feel sketchy, though, kind of drafting these like running backs who are on the downturn of their career. Like, Alvin Kamara is nowhere near the same guy that we've seen, early on in his career a few years ago. So it's kind of like you're hoping you can get him before he just completely falls off. So it's sketchy, but RB16, I think, is a fair ranking. My running back 17 is going to be Kenneth Walker, someone who I moved up a little bit from my last set of rankings. It looks like he's the clear favorite to lead this backfield. I thought Charbonnet would have some shot to kind of work his way into a solid committee. It's not looking that way at the moment. Kenneth Walker was the running back 20 last year. I think his ceiling is just going to depend on how involved Charbonnet is as a pass catcher and then also on the goal line, because I think an argument could be made that Charbonnet is better in both those areas, and in fantasy, those are the 2 most areas where you want to get touches, so we'll see how Kenneth Walker looks. They have been talking about potentially getting him more involved as a pass catcher. That would be fun to see, but right now I think tier 6, running back 17, a fair spot. Now, shifting into tier 7, my running back 18 is going to be Aaron Jones, and he's coming off his worst fantasy season since his rookie year, was the running back 26 in points per game, but I'm really not panicking. He was kind of banged up, and it really just came down to bad touchdown luck. I think he played 11 games, only scored 3 touchdowns. Tough to really blame him there. He's lined up to be the Vikings' lead back. I think mid-tier RB2 was a very fair spot to have him. Behind Aaron Jones, I have James Conner, and I'm continuing to move Conner farther and farther up. I was thinking earlier on in the offseason, they draft Trey Benson. You're probably looking at some sort of committee here, a pretty even split. Trey Benson, the guy who's going to be the running back of the future. That's obviously the concern with James Conner, is that Trey Benson is forcing that committee. But as of right now, like going into the season, it doesn't seem like Trey Benson is making that extreme push. Now, that's not to say that won't happen later on. This could definitely be very close. But I think as it stands right now, James Conner should be heading into the season as the clear running back 1. And Conner was legitimately good last year. Like, I was someone who was very in on him for fantasy, but I was just expecting him to be like a low efficiency, high volume option who could like limp into running back one production. He had a solid workload, but he was legit good. 5 yards per carry, 1.02 rushing yards over expected per attempt. That was fourth in the NFL. He really had a legit resurgence in terms of his efficiency, and I think he could just end up being the lead back on a good Cardinals offense. So a fair spot to draft him in my opinion. Then we have Ramondre Stevenson. Had a rough 2023, was the running back 27 in points per game. It was going to be tough to do anything with how bad that Patriots offense was, but they extended him. They committed to him. Based on that extension, I think they want him to be their clear-cut running back one. Antonio Gibson may kind of work his way in. This offense still has some question marks, but I think Ramondre is like a mid-tier RB2. Makes a lot of sense. Also in Tier 7, we have David Montgomery, and he's kind of a guy here where he has some limited upside if Jahmyr Gibbs stays healthy. He was the running back 15 in points per game last year. If Gibbs is healthy, I think that would drop off a little bit just because I think Gibbs is going to take a bigger piece of the pie. But even if that happens, he could still be giving you a mid to back end RB2 production. But he is, probably a mid to high end RB1 if Jahmyr Gibbs were to ever miss time. So it's kind of rare where you can draft someone to give you running back 2 production, but then they also have that extra added in handcuff upside where if Jahmyr Gibbs goes down, David Montgomery is like locked and loaded, RB1 in your lineup every single week. And then my final Tier 7 running back is going to be Zamir White. And admittedly, he seems a little bit risky to me. Has a lot of traits of a dead zone running back. He's day 3 pick, doesn't have the draft capital. He's fairly unproven. He's not on a great offense. He's kind of getting propped up drafts based on the expectation that he's going to handle a large workload. But for whatever reason, I'm still somewhat interested in him this season. The Raiders seem to be very high on him. Doesn't seem like a spot where like fantasy people are just assuming, all right, well, let's just give him this monster workload. It seems like the Raiders want to feed him. Seems like they really like the dude. And in his opportunities in 2023, even though it was a smallish sample size, he was still really good. 0.33 rushing yards over expected per attempt. That was much better than Josh Jacobs, who was at negative 0.37. He started 4 games where Jacobs missed, clear-cut starter. In those 4 games, he averaged 24.3 opportunities and 114 scrimmage yards per game. So when he got his shot, he went out there, he played well. There's not a ton of competition within this running back room. You have Alexander Madison, who was rough last year. Dylan Laube seems like he's making some noise in training camp, potential receiving back, which could limit Zamir White's upside, but you're probably drafting him more for his workload on the ground, potential touchdown upside being the goal line back. So I think Zamir White, very end here of Tier 7, it's a fair ranking. Now shifting into Tier 8, my running back 23 is going to be Jonathan Brooks. He's someone I had to move down from my last rankings video. I was probably a little bit too optimistic when it came to his return timetable. Seems like now they're aiming for week 3, week 4 return. He's likely going to have a slow start. If he's coming back week 3, week 4, I don't think they're just going to, throw him out there and give him a workhorse role. You're probably looking at some sort of committee week 3, week 4, week 5, week 6, maybe into like mid-season. But I still do think that Jonathan Brooks has the upside to be a league winner down the stretch. We know when healthy, Dave Canales wants to use a workhorse. We saw that with Rachaad White last year. So I think if you're in a spot where you think you can kind of tread water, still be in a position to make the playoffs, if you draft Jonathan Brooks, he might not be giving you a ton early on in the season, but I think he could be that dude that really leads you in that championship push over the second half. The next running back, my running back 24, is going to be DeAndre Swift. And I'm pretty lukewarm at this point with Swift. When you look at the contract they gave him in free agency, you'd think he'd be lined up to be the running back 1 on an offense that I'm pretty high on. Caleb Williams coming in, a lot of really strong weapons. My concern here is Khalil Herbert. Now, we just saw the Bears' first, or the second, I guess, their preseason game, but the first one where they actually played the starters. I think DeAndre Swift played the first drive, maybe didn't go out there in the second one. Khalil Herbert definitely out-touched him, had way more carries. And I'm not super concerned that Khalil Herbert's going to take over as the running back 1, but as long as he's still on this team, he is going to be a nuisance to DeAndre Swift. Now, I definitely think it's possible that maybe they're showcasing Khalil Herbert. They're going to trade him to a team like the Cowboys, the Chargers, one of these teams that needs a solid running back. But the problem is just right now drafting him, Khalil Herbert's still there, and there's really no way around it. Like, Khalil Herbert is the better pure runner, straight up, right? All the metrics are going to point to that. Khalil Herbert is a really good pure runner. DeAndre Swift has that receiving upside, but how much of that upside is going to be unlocked when you're playing on an offense with DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, Cole Kmet? Caleb Williams also isn't a statue back there. Like, he can move, he can rush, he can take off. So I think a Khalil Herbert trade would make me feel a lot better. But I think right now I'm in like that fringe RB2 territory, likely RB1 on a good offense, but what's the ultimate ceiling actually looking like for a guy like DeAndre Swift? Now, my running back 25 and 26 are going to come from the same backfield. It's going to be Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris. These guys were back-to-back in points per game last year. Warren was the running back 29. Najee was the running back 30. I think this offense should be a decent bit better here in 2024, but the concern is that if they're both healthy, the upside's pretty much non-existent. This isn't going to be a top-tier offense, even if they're better, and you're splitting pretty much 50-50 between two running backs on an offense that, best case scenario, is probably middle of the pack. They also do have that handcuff upside, though. Like I talked about with David Montgomery, if Jaylen Warren goes down, Najee's probably playable as a potential running back 1. Same thing goes for Jaylen Warren. If Najee goes down, he can step up, probably playable as like a fringe running back 1. I just slightly prefer Jaylen Warren here because I just straight up think he's the better player. He's going to be more involved as a pass catcher. Najee's going to be more involved near the goal line, the short yardage situation. So I think they're pretty much neck and neck as like high-end running back 3s. Then behind those two, I have Raheem Mostert. And I did move Raheem Mostert down a few spots from my last video. He had a great year last year, no doubt about it, was the running back 4 in points per game. The concern is very clear, though. He's 32 years old. 2023 was a massive outlier when you're looking at his entire career. And I also think he's just going to have Jalen Wright kind of nipping at his heels here, where Devon Achane, I think Achane's going to play his way out of, being in this like three-headed committee. I think Achane's going to get his, and I think if Jalen Wright is excelling, playing well, Raheem Mostert is the guy who's going to hurt from that. So maybe Wright kind of takes like a year where he's just playing behind these two. Raheem Mostert is still operating in a solid split, and he ends up outperforming this area. Like, I think that's definitely possible. But I think his floor is also very low, where he could really have his workload drastically decreased. Maybe he misses a game. Jalen Wright steps up, plays well. So I guess kind of high ceiling, low floor pick here for Raheem Mostert. If you're confident he holds on to that starting spot or like top 2 spot, then, by all means draft him higher than this. But this is where I'm kind of settling here, weighing that risk reward. After Raheem Mostert, the final tier 8 running back is going to be Brian Robinson. And I think he's being a little bit slept on heading into the season. I've never been someone who's like overly high on him for fantasy or overly high on him in terms of like real life running backs, but he was the running back 22 in points per game last year. Decently efficient, 0.22 rushing yards over expected per attempt. The Commanders lost Antonio Gibson. They added Austin Eckler. I think Eckler should be the receiving back. I think that's definitely still in his wheelhouse, but as a runner, he seems pretty cooked. I know he was banged up last year, but I think Brian Robinson's going to handle the bulk of the work on the ground. He's going to have that touchdown upside, even though you do have Daniels kind of vulturing. I think he's a fine fringe running back too. If you're running a hero RB build, I think he's a solid running back too. If you're going 0 RB, I think he's one of those guys you could like potentially be starting week to week in either one of your running back spots. Now pivoting into tier 9, two guys from the same offense. We're going Chase Brown and Zach Moss. And at this point, it's still very unclear what the split is going to look like between these two. Right now, I think we're looking at a pretty heavy committee here, probably with Chase Brown favoring more of the receiving work, Zach Moss getting more of that goal line usage. But I think they both do have real upside if they can kind of pull away, secure 55, 60+% of this backfield. And they also both have that handcuff upside where Zach Moss goes down, Chase Brown becomes a great option. If Chase Brown goes down, Zach Moss becomes a great option. I guess we'll see what the splits look like, throughout preseason. We'll continue to monitor the reports. But right now, in my opinion, these two should pretty much be neck and neck. Even if they're in a committee, I think they're both going to be relevant on a good offense, but obviously the upside comes from one of these dudes kind of pulling away. Behind those two, I have Javonte Williams, and he's honestly a pretty tough guy to rank because this Broncos backfield feels very up in the air. We've got some weird reports, talking about Javonte like potentially being on the bubble for being cut. I would be absolutely shocked if he was released. They don't have him extended. This is the final year of his rookie deal. It would seem very odd for them to release Javonte Williams, and I still favor him to be the running back 1 here. There's no doubt about it. He was rough last year. Coming off the torn ACL, he averaged 3.6 yards per carry, had the 8th worst rushing yards over expected per attempt, but prior to tearing his ACL, he was looking like a very effective overall NFL running back. Not everyone is Breece Hall, where you can come back and just be an absolute monster after tearing your ACL. A lot of the times, the first year back, it's not great. Then you can bounce back like, a year plus removed from the injury. So I'm not totally giving up on Javonte. I think he should be the favorite to lead this backfield, but I'm also fine if you want to be throwing darts on guys like Jaleel McLaughlin, Audric Estime in your later rounds, because this backfield definitely isn't, set in stone at this point. And then my final tier 9 running backs, it's going to be Tajay Spears and Tony Pollard. I think a lot of people are favoring Tony Pollard by a decent amount. They think he's going to lead this backfield. And I get why, he's the running back one for the Cowboys. He had some great years being in a committee situation with Ezekiel Elliott, and Tajay Spears, more of the younger, unknown option. I personally am expecting a very, very close split between these two. What we've heard from their coaching staff has kind of backed that up. So I think, if they're both healthy, they probably have back-end RB2 upside if this Titans offense looks good. If the offense isn't great, they're probably like RB3s, not great flex options. But once again, these running backs in these committees, they do have the contingent handcuff upside if one of them were to go down. Now, shifting into the 10th and final tier, this is where we're getting into potential running back 2s or gross unstable running back 1s. So starting off with Devin Singletary, definitely looks like the favorite to lead this Giants backfield. I know Tyrone Tracy and Eric Gray, both had some decent plays in their preseason game, but Devin Singletary was the guy resting, not playing because Daniel Jones wasn't in there. They weren't rolling with most of their starters. He has the history with Brian Daboll from their time with the Bills. He's not a super flashy player, but in each of his last 3 seasons, he's gone for at least 1,000 scrimmage yards, 30-plus receptions. I think he's like an RB3 flex option with potential RB2 upside if he does just lock up that running back 1 role. Another guy kind of in a gross situation has the potential to lead his backfield. It's going to be Rico Dowdle, and I've been pretty pro Rico Dowdle for most of this offseason. For whatever reason, people were viewing Zeke as the significantly better option, going multiple rounds ahead of Rico Dowdle in terms of ADP, and at this point, it seems like Dowdle's the favorite to lead this backfield. It's definitely not a pretty situation. I'm not some massive Rico Dowdle defender. I don't think he's some amazing NFL running back, but I'd rather take a flyer on him who's more unproven, getting good reports, than the shell of a guy like Ezekiel Elliott, who has proven for at least a couple of years now that he really doesn't have it anymore. And I just think someone in this offense, someone from this running back room, is going to be very fantasy relevant. This is going to be one of the higher scoring offenses in the NFL. Even Tony Pollard last year, he was terribly inefficient, and he was a massive bust with where you drafted him, but you were drafting him second, maybe tail end of the first round. You're getting these guys, outside of pick 100. So if they can, secure a decent portion of this offense, someone's going to be playable, but you also do have the downside of the fact that none of these guys are established. So Rico Dowdle, Zeke, if they're sucking it up, they could be replaced by someone within their own backfield. They could also be replaced via a trade, a guy like Khalil Herbert or just one of these other veteran options. So it's a very unsecure situation, but Rico Dowdle, he would be my favorite to lead this backfield on a pretty valuable offense. Another guy in one of these situations where maybe he's leading the backfield, maybe he's not, Gus Edwards here for the Chargers. Right now, it looks like he is the favorite to be the running back 1, competing with J.K. Dobbins coming off the torn Achilles, day 3, Kamani Vidal, but not a guy who has a ton of upside. He doesn't catch passes. I think this is still going to be somewhat of a committee, but if he's the running back 1, he should at least be playable at portions this season. Behind Edwards, we're getting into that RB2 territory. I have Trey Benson, day 2 rookie pick. Talked about him earlier on with James Conner. Right now, he's looking like more of a handcuff, but he definitely has the upside to play his way into a committee with James Conner on an offense that has some upside. And I do think he's the Cardinals' running back of the future. So especially if this team's kind of struggling, maybe James Conner's not looking great, at some point maybe they just hand over the reins to Trey Benson. They let him go out there, lead this backfield because they know he's going to be the guy to do it, in the future. And then after him, we have Zach Charbonnet. And I originally was a little bit more optimistic that Charbonnet would kind of work his way into somewhat of a committee with Kenneth Walker. Not looking super likely at this point, but I still think the case can be made, like I mentioned earlier, that Charbonnet is better in the short yardage and better as a receiving back. So I think worst case scenario, he's a handcuff with still some upside to potentially weasel his way into this backfield and eat into Kenneth Walker's work. Then we have Blake Corum, another young running back 2, might be the single best handcuff in fantasy this year. We know Sean McVay likes to use a workhorse. Kyron Williams has had his injury issues. It seems almost inevitable that Blake Corum is going to get at least a few opportunities to dominate the usage in a game where Kyron Williams misses. is injured. And if he plays well in those opportunities, could potentially carve out a role moving forward. And then I guess we're going top 41 because my last two players are from the same backfield. It's going to be Nick Chubb and Jerome Ford. This is a pretty tough backfield to break down, and it's just because of Nick Chubb's, injury. His return timetable isn't super clear. When he is back, we have no idea what he's going to look like, what form he's going to be in. Nick Chubb's going to be 29 during the season, turning 29, coming off a gruesome knee injury. We know he's been one of the best running backs in the NFL, arguably the best pure runner we've had, in recent years, but there's no guarantee he's even close to the same dude that we remember. You have Jerome Ford, who's probably going to be like a weekly running back too until Nick Chubb gets back, but then when Chubb is back, what's the split going to look like? If Chubb looks great, which, probably seems a little bit unlikely, but if he's looking good, then Jerome Ford's probably not playable. Maybe this turns into some sort of gross committee where they're both like weekly running back threes. Just a lot of unknowns. At this point, I guess I just slightly favor Nick Chubb because I think he's going to get the benefit of the doubt where once he comes back, even if he's not amazing, I still think he's going to get the shot to lead this backfield. So slightly prefer Nick Chubb, but tough to, give a strong stance on either one of these dudes. But that is going to wrap it up for my top 40/41 running backs this year for fantasy football. If you enjoyed the video, do me a huge favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. If you stayed all the way through the end, thank you. I really appreciate it. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.